this afternoon to discuss an incredibly important issue. Actually, before we begin even with the introductions, we have Congressman Mooney here and Congressman from West Virginia and Congressman Banks from Indiana and Congressman Doug Lamborn, who thanks to Doug Lamborn and his wonderful, wonderful staffer, Lindsay Schneider, they got us this room, and we're very, very, very grateful to them. So I know that Congressman Lamborn is in an extremely tight schedule, and before we even begin, if you could just say a few remarks, Congressman.
Thank you, Sarah, for you and your organization, the great work that you do on this and other important issues. As you know, the whole problem that we're seeing in Iran is not getting any better. The people are speaking out, the people are demonstrating, and unfortunately the people are getting killed. So we need action, and I think finally we do have an administration that is going to be taking action. Nikki Haley is doing a wonderful job at the United Nations. President Trump is speaking out on this, not just giving lip service, like I think is all we saw in the previous administration. In fact, they were actually going out of their way to not put pressure on the Iranians because they so much wanted JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And that was a bad deal. Ambassador Bolton, you have done a wonderful job speaking out. I've read your comments in the Wall Street Journal and other forums, where you do a good job of pointing out all the problems with JCPOA. So we just need to take action now and support the Iranian people. We've had some legislation, the Countering Adversarial Nations Through Sanctions Act that Congress has passed, putting pressure that hopefully will get the attention of the mullahs and continue to pressure them into going in the right direction. And I'm a co-sponsor of the Iran Non-Nuclear Sanctions Act of 2017 that I've co-sponsored with Peter Roskam, Leonard Lance, and Lee Zeldin. So this is the kind of legislation that we need to do to put the pressure on the Iranian theocracy. They need to do the right thing and listen to the people. So Sarah, I want to thank you for your outspokenness and organizing on all of this. Ambassador Bolton, please keep speaking out on this, and I look forward to your comments. The people of Iran, they just want freedom, and they're not getting it from the current regime. And we missed such a golden opportunity in 2009 when the Green Movement was taking place. And I remember pressuring the administration, people saying, why did you not act? And they said, well, maybe we missed an opportunity. Well, that's the understatement of the century. We can't miss that opportunity now. We need to help this dangerous theocracy actually have some kind of listening to the people of the world, listening to their own people. And then we won't have Iran being such a malign influence in the Middle East, and actually even now in our own hemisphere. So thank you once again, Sarah, and Mr. Ambassador, thank you.
On December 28th, the people took to the streets and the Iranian city of Mashhad. What had begun as a purely economic protest has morphed into a robust protest, despite what the Iranian regime has been saying and doing. Now the signs there, they have been displaying signs saying, you know, out of Gaza, out of Syria, think about us. And of course that has to be contrasted with what happened in 2009 when under President Obama, you know, millions of people from the Green Party took to the streets, you know, protesting the sham election of Ahmadinejad, and skulls were cracked. People were ported off to this notorious Evin prison to be tortured and raped and never to be seen or heard from again. And they were holding up placards saying, down with the dictatorship, and Obama, where are you? So of course, as Congressman Lamborn said, you know, Nikki Haley and President Trump rather, have said, you know, have said some wonderful, wonderful remarks. And I think people have, although I wrote up longer remarks, I think people are not here actually to hear me, but they are here to hear our esteemed colleagues, our panel. Ambassador John Bolton has a wonderful and lengthy history. He was the U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations and served until his resignation in December 2006. Prior to his appointment in August of 2005, Ambassador Bolton served as Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security from May 2001 to May 2005. You've all read his bio. It's extraordinary and lengthy, and we are extremely honored to have him, you know, as a guest with us today on our panel. Omri Sarin, I think, is a rising star within the academic and intellectual community here in Washington, and works for the Israel Project. He has written for commentary. He is the managing director of the Israel Project. He is a fellow at the Claremont Institute and a PhD candidate at USC's Annenberg School. Omri has been involved in politics, policy, and press, international affairs for around 2 decades now. And we are also very privileged to have with us a dear friend, Mandazan Irving, who came to the United States from Iran as a political refugee on June 17, 1980. She is the founder and president of the Alliance of Iranian Women, which is a human rights group with deep connections within Iran and throughout the Iranian diaspora. So without further ado, I'd like to give the mic over to Ambassador John Bolton.
Thanks. Just in time for Congressman King to come in, but I want to thank Congressman Lamborn, Congressman Mooney, Steve, good to see you. Oops. Good to see you. And thanks to all of you for coming, especially thanks to Sarah and Emmett for putting this together. It's extremely timely and very important, so a real opportunity. And I think that we're going to see in not too much time, people will recognize that what has just happened inside Iran in the past 10 days is a turning point in history. You've seen reporting on it, contrasting it with what happened in the summer of 2009. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding in the Western media, starting with the New York Times, nothing new there, but also because, of course, the government has shut down as much of the foreign press's ability to get out into the countryside where many of these demonstrations have taken place. But piecing together what we know and what has come out through communications to Iranian Americans here and to the Iranian diaspora in Europe, I think it's very clear that these outpourings of popular opinion represent a dagger pointed at the heart of the mullah's regime. They have crossed an important line here. This is fundamentally different and a much graver threat to the regime than the Green Movement of 2009. I think there are a lot of factors that have built into it. I think from what we can tell, there's no central direction to it. There's no coordination, at least in the early days. That has its pluses and its minuses for the future. We don't know exactly how it will end, although I think the best guess we can make at the moment is this current round of demonstrations, because of oppression in some cases, but because of the lack of coordination in others, will probably end. Perhaps it has already. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think the fact the government didn't fall at the first sign of real opposition isn't all that surprising. But I think, like many authoritarian governments that look very imposing from the outside, I think a kick at the rotten door of the Ayatollah's regime could really bring it down. But looking at what has brought us to this point, I do think that economic dissatisfaction is a major element of it. Not the dissatisfaction that the media class in New York think that, well, you know, they didn't have enough benefits from the nuclear deal in 2015, that if only we had been more forthcoming, the moderates in Iran would have done better and everybody would have been happy with the nuclear deal, reinforcing the regime itself. That's just completely irrelevant to what I think you're seeing in the streets of not just Tehran, but perhaps over 100 towns and cities across the country. I think what the people are reflecting is the result of decades of economic mismanagement by the Ayatollahs. And not just mismanagement that's hurt small business people and workers and farmers around the country, but has resulted in massive corruption and the distribution of assets from oil sales and other aspects of the economy to favored Ayatollahs and their families. The Rafsanjani clan, just to name the most prominent, has gotten rich over the past nearly 40 years from the Islamic Revolution, so have a lot of others. Generals in the Revolutionary Guard, which increasingly control large sectors of the economy, have benefited. And I think that's why the economic motivation translated so quickly, almost instantly, into calls for the regime itself to be overthrown, because the mismanagement and corruption are endemic to the regime. It's not the result of the Ayatollahs taking a bad policy turn one day. It's the nature of the regime itself. And I think this is you know, over the years there have been riots and demonstrations in towns and cities all over Iran that have not been covered effectively by the Western press because they're not out there where it happens. But this dissatisfaction has been building, and I think now has potentially reached a critical mass, laid on top of which are other dissatisfactions that we've seen because of the population demographic. 2/3, 70%, depending on your estimate of the population's under 30. It's a well-educated population. Many of them have studied abroad. They know they could lead a different kind of life than what they lead under the Ayatollahs. They do have access to the internet. They or their friends or their relatives go to Dubai or Abu Dhabi or Doha across the Gulf. There's no secret here that the rest of the world doesn't live under the kind of theocratic regime that they live under. And let's be honest as well, there's ethnic dissatisfaction in Iran too. Only 50% of the population is Persian, 30 to 40% Azeri, Baluchi, Arab. Not all of these dissatisfactions vector the same way necessarily, but this regime is unpopular for a lot of reasons, and these demonstrations have made it as graphic as I think you can. The obvious advantage that the regime has, it has the gun. It wasn't afraid to use it in 2009. We've seen some examples of it already. We estimate perhaps 20 or more people killed. According to reports, including some admissions by Iranian officials, they've arrested, the Iranian contention is they've arrested, the government contention, they've arrested 3,700. I know at Fox this morning they were talking about over 4,000. I'm sure that number is going to turn out to be low. That's a significant response by the mullahs to these demonstrations. And I think it indicates the level of fear and concern that they feel. We've heard reports from Syria, for example, that elements of the Iranian military that are in Syria have been called back to Iran Revolutionary Guard units, perhaps also indicating their concern about the extent of the opposition. So I think what we've got now is they've reached a new plateau, and the question is, what, if anything, the United States should be doing with respect to this opposition. Now I think, as Congressman Lamborn said, the first and most important thing is the President of the United States has spoken out about it. And of course, the dregs of the Obama administration have responded by saying, oh, you know, this is not about us, this is about Iran, we should be quiet. Look, I think when the President of the United States speaks, it carries enormous weight. You can agree or disagree with it, it carries enormous weight. We know, and I believe this, from statements by dissidents during the Soviet era, Anatoly Sharansky and others, that when they heard Ronald Reagan talk about the evil empire, they were in prison, in internal exile, wherever they were, it gave them courage, it gave them hope, sustenance, that people outside knew what was happening. And I think the same is true inside Iran. So I wish our friends in Europe were a little bit more outspoken about it. I think we know the reason why. It's the same trap represented by the Iranian nuclear deal that the Iranian regime and the Obama White House understood. If you can pull the West into an economic relationship with Iran, you could basically hold back our inclination to stop their nuclear efforts and their terrorism, support for international terrorism, and I think it's clearly had its effect in Europe. Many people will say, but you know, it would be wrong for the United States to aid the opposition because that would weaken the opposition, it would taint them, it would give the government in Tehran the ability to say, this is all inspired by the United States, and thus they increase their support among the American people. Now look, there are several things wrong with this analysis. Do you think they're not blaming it on us already? Or, well, you know, just for old time's sake, if nothing else, blaming it on the United Kingdom? That's the standard default position of the Ayatollahs and many other authoritarian governments. We could go to sleep for the next month and they blame what had happened on us. So if we're going to get blamed for it, we might as well see if we can't do something effective. And I think really the best judges of what outside assistance is effective, what resources they need the most that we can consider, are the requests from opposition figures themselves. If they're willing to undertake the risk of receiving support externally from us or from others, if they're willing to stand up to the Ayatollah's criticism, I think that's their political judgment that ought to be respected. It's not that we're going to give them a blank check. We're going to look carefully at what they ask for. I don't think American support needs to be military in any form or fashion at this point. I think financial support is important. Communication support, given what we know about how the regime reacted to the demonstrations, and perhaps other things as well. All of this ought to be part of a more active effort that I think would be communicated across Iran very, very quickly. And I think it would be a message to the regime that we're more than just talk, we're actually prepared to do something about it. There's an enormous Iranian-American community here in this country and in Europe. I think there's a lot of use that we could make of the Iranian-American community. I think they want to be involved. So I don't think we should shy away from this. We've got a strategic reason here to want to see this regime overthrown. And I've been saying for over 10 years it ought to be declared American policy to overthrow the regime. It's a characteristic of the threats we face in the world that regimes like this oppress their own people, seek weapons of mass destruction, and sponsor terrorism. That's a job description for the Ayatollahs. And so the threat that we face is something that is legitimately on the American national security radar screen. So that then brings me to what I think is the real $64 question, and again, that's why the timing of this program is so good, what to do about the Iranian nuclear deal. We know what the calendar says. The President faces another 90-day certification decision under the misbegotten corporate pardon bill, one of the worst pieces of legislation, I have to say, Congress managed to produce in the last several years. But also the decision on whether to continue waiving the sanctions. Two distinct decisions, but coming very close together in the next few days. Now, my view on this is very straightforward. I think this deal was a strategic disaster for the United States when it was entered into. It hasn't gotten any better with age. The sooner the President abrogates it entirely, and creates a new international political reality, the better. I think it's particularly important as we see the progress North Korea has made on its nuclear and ballistic missile programs. I think there's every reason to believe over decades there's been cooperation between Iran and North Korea, certainly on ballistic missiles, almost certainly on the nuclear side. And seeing this instability in Iran, the other half of the two-sided coin of what's left of the axis of evil, really gives us an opportunity to have an impact on the Korean part of the equation as well. So I would, without hesitation, abrogate the nuclear deal, call the sanctions back into effect. I think Congress could come up with other sanctions as well. But this is the last moment to reduce pressure on the regime. Now they are feeling the heat, and bringing the waived sanctions back into effect, I think could have a very, very important impact. Now, again, there are people who say, but don't call attention to the United States. Don't make U.S. Agreement or acquiescence, continued acquiescence in the nuclear deal the issue. It's going to be the issue anyway. Whether we stay in it or get out of it, we're going to be a focus of attention. And I think because the deal strategically is bad for the United States, there's simply no argument for continuing it in operation. The Europeans suffer from it because our technology, our licenses are withheld from their technology, and they can't make sales to Iran or investments in Iran. You know, I just weep copious tears for them. Life is hard, you know. I don't believe in supporting sponsors of terrorism, people who are still pursuing their nuclear capabilities, people who have the capability of buying from North Korea any technology that North Korea has, and are actively working against the interest of the United States, Israel, and our other friends and allies in the Middle East across the board. We have to recognize the reality and take the appropriate steps. So I don't know what the President will do on this subject. His advisors, according to all of the usual reports, are divided. But if you believe, as I do, that what has happened across Iran provides a historic opportunity, this is the last point at which we should step aside and not try and take advantage of it. It may be controversial in various capitals in Europe. That's one reason you have a State Department to go overseas and effectively advocate the American point of view to our friends in Europe, not simply report back what the Europeans are dissatisfied about our performance. And if we act effectively and decisively, as I say, I think we do create a new reality, and I think that's important. So let me just close by saying how much I appreciate the members of Congress who are here and all of you. So I think it demonstrates you understand just how important this is for the people of Iran, for many, many others across the Middle East, and certainly for the United States. Thank you very much.
Thank you. What I'm thinking as I listen to this description, which I'm very glad I got to hear, and I look back through history, and I think when John F. Kennedy denied the air cover for the Bay of Pigs, the revolution there failed. And the people in Cuba have lived under that kind of suppressed Marxism ever since. And when the Russians rolled the tanks into places like Budapest and Prague, they suppressed the revolution there. And the people lived under that Marxism till 1989 and 1990. When I stood in the spot on Tiananmen Square in Beijing, where that man faced down that tank on June 1st of 1989, and they rolled the tanks in there, and they suppressed the revolution, or we might have seen the end of at least militaristic Marxism in the world if they had succeeded in Tiananmen Square. Time after time, we haven't been there to support those people that are just bursting for freedom within them. And I think also the time that the Kurds believed that they were going to have U.S. support in 1992, and Saddam gassed them instead. And I look at the divisions that are there in Iran today with the Baluchis in the south, which were described, the Kurds, the Azerbaijanis in the north. I know that they want their freedom. And the Kurds in the north of Iraq want their freedom. And so my message to the Iranian people is, don't let up, don't leave the streets, don't leave the square, stay out there. Over time, the people that are able to stay in the streets and stay in the square, they ended up owning their country and running their country, and they are the ones then that decided the determination of their own people. And this has been too long. I think that Jimmy Carter saw the Ayatollah Khamenei as a religious fundamentalist, therefore good. Instead, all of these years, the Iranian people have lived under that kind of tyranny. So I think this is a seminal moment in history. They had the Green Revolution in 2009, came up short. This is the time it's got to happen. And I want to see a resolution that calls for regime change in Iran. We're going to bring one that says we support the Iranian people. That'll happen, I think, Thursday if I saw the memo right, or maybe even tomorrow. But I think we need to be stronger. I think that Ambassador Bolton is right, that this Congress needs to call for a regime change in Iran. This is the time to do it. It's not just the economy, in my view, because how did this erupt after they got $150 billion to spend into their economy? Well, they're misspending it as part of that. So I think it's cultural, it's political, it's ethnic, it's the heart of people that want to live free and determine their own destination. We should be for that in every chance we've got. So thanks a lot. It's a privilege for me to be here today and hear this.
I'd like to ask their support. Iranian women are very progressive and they have fought against this regime from day one. I was in the first uprising 2 weeks after Khomeini in Iran. And we got beaten up. My shoulder is still hurting because of the batons I received from the people. Women of Iran have been rising up every day, every month. They're all over the place. They have been imprisoned with their babies. They have been imprisoned with pregnant. Their homes have been broken into 5 o'clock in the morning, beaten up in front of their husbands and children. They have done 1 million signature petition that instead of 1 million, they got 1 million volunteers to collect petition against the regime. Nobody in America anywhere talks about these things, and nobody knows about what the Iranian women do. 2009, there was Iranian women who were leading. Now Iranian women are leading. There was the first day it started was a woman that got on the sidewalk of the busy section of the city, went on the top of a barrel, took her white scarf off and started waving it. Women of Iran are in front of the battle lines, and they have been completely ignored by everything and everybody. I want to ask members of the Congress if it would really be very important if we can have a conference like this. I'm sure Sarah would mind to help. We have an organization, Alliance of Iranian Women, Iranian American women. We've been there for 22 years. We've had some members of the Congress who've supported us. They have passed resolutions for human rights of women and children in Iran, and so on. But we were begging for a conference against gender apartheid in Iran. What's going on in Iran is an absolute gender apartheid. We have fought about racial apartheid. We have fought against the dictatorial communism, but completely ignored the women who live under the tyranny of Islamic clergies. And we are willing and we are begging if we can have a conference in the Congress with your support to have a conference. We're going to go speak and give you documents and videos to prove to you that women of Iran deserve much more. They can't be slaves of men. That's what they are. Under Sharia law, women are property. Women and children are properties of men. And this is not fair. Iranian women have been fighting clergy for 150 years. They succeeded, but now again, they are under the system, and nobody goes to their help. Thank you.
So I'll just speak from here. I'll be the downer after Ambassador Bolton's overview and the impassioned speech we just heard. The technical decision that the president faces, as Ambassador Bolton referenced, is whether or not to waive a series of sanctions. So there are, as you remember, the Iran deal did not go over particularly well in Congress. It was imposed by bipartisan majorities in both chambers. And so no sanctions were repealed, right? Sanctions were laws, they weren't repealed. Instead, the then president, availed himself of a bunch of waivers, including 4 specific waivers that have to be renewed periodically. The first one expires actually tomorrow. The big one expires on Friday. The question then is whether or not he waives those sanctions and stays in the deal or not. And I want to provide a framework. We'll have time for questions. I want to provide a framework for, as you think about these things, so that you understand what the technical details are and what's at stake. Understand at the beginning what happened and the way that sanctions got unwound, because it's very important for how Congress is going to react and how this administration is going to react. For decades, Congress, in cooperation with various administrations, built a patchwork of sanctions that overlapped executive orders, that used congressional authorities, that used some of their own authorities, and most of them, many of them, and certainly the framework for them, predated concerns with the nuclear deal, famously predated what used to be the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act that became the Iran Sanctions Act. These were non-nuclear sanctions. We had sanctions on ballistic missiles, and continue to have some. Human rights, terrorism, corruption, illicit finance, a range and a patchwork of sanctions. They implicated the entirety of Iran. Under the Patriot Acts, under Section 311 of the Patriot Act, the entire country of Iran is a jurisdiction of primary concern for money laundering, for instance. The problem, and when negotiations began, so we're talking now late 2013, Congress very quickly began to tell the Obama administration, you're giving away too much for too little. And the Obama administration answered, very specifically they answered, this is going to be nuclear relief for nuclear concessions. Iran would cease the military dimensions of its nuclear program in a verifiable way. We would lift sanctions on people who we sanctioned for suspicion of illicit nuclear activity. Makes a certain kind of coherence. We think we sanctioned them because we thought they were engaging in illicit nuclear activity. They were going to stop that. We would lift those sanctions. That ran up against Iranian demands. The Iranians said that they would not make the nuclear concessions that the Americans required because they were not getting sufficient relief. And so the Obama administration, and I'll explain in a second why this isn't a partisan view, even though it's going to come off as a partisan view. The Obama administration, in as many words, redefined a bunch of non-nuclear sanctions as nuclear sanctions so that they could lift them and placate the Iranians. And this was both broken and reported out by the Associated Press at the time, that said that the only reason that the administration was able to do it was because of their unique interpretation of what nuclear sanctions were. Essentially, the Obama administration said, since our overarching concern with Iran is nuclear, if you think about it, most sanctions are nuclear. Well, they weren't. They were human rights sanctions, and they were ballistic missile sanctions, and they were illicit finance sanctions. That intersected with another need that they had, which was to get the entire regime on board. The reason why I'm flagging this for you is because it's about to become important, and in fact, arguably the central issue as we move forward through the week. So the Iranians came to the Americans late, and they said, and when I say the Americans, I mean our diplomats late in Lausanne and in Vienna, and said, the regime's not on board yet. I can't, Zarif would say, presumably I can't get the supreme leader on board. And so there were specific, enormous concessions on non-nuclear issues, non-nuclear sanctions that were made in order to effectively bribe the regime to come along. The two that are getting attention this week were sanctions relief for the Central Bank of Iran, which we thought was engaged in a variety of terror financing and illicit finance and so on, and on the supreme leader's personal empire, his business empire worth tens of billions of dollars, EIKO. Those were granted as nuclear relief. Why does that matter? Because last week, on December 28th, protesters took to the streets and refocused attention on two things that were not supposed to happen. And as we go forward through this week, understand that two things that used to be a debate are no longer a debate, and that changes policymaking. The first thing that we were told when and a number of speakers have flagged this, when we were told when Iran was granted sanctions relief is they would spend it on guns and roads, not butter. We now know that's not true. The regime spent its windfall on overseas adventurism, and the protesters are calling them out for it. That was inevitable. Many advocates of the Iran deal have now begun saying, see, we unmasked the regime. The answer is that, we didn't need them to be unmasked. We knew they would spend it that way, and we could have saved. And the Syrian people are the worst for it, among others, because of the gambit that they made. The second thing that was punctured was the idea that there are moderates versus conservatives in Iran. Instead, something that the Trump administration has been saying for months was validated, which is that it's all one big regime with reformists and conservative pragmatists and conservatives and hardliners all on the same team. Those are two things that used to be a debate that are no longer a debate because we saw reformists come out against the protesters on behalf of the Supreme Leader. Why does that matter? The administration has been saying both of these things, and now will need to make a decision on if it waives, if they do not take Ambassador Bolton's advice and they do not withdraw from the deal, if they waive, what in addition are they going to do? And you have this puncturing of myths by the protesters. Now we know it's one big regime. Now we know that sanctions relief that went beyond nuclear is being used by that regime. That creates a new focus on going after the regime assets and entities that were, in technical language, delisted, that received sanctions relief under the deal. So one of the things, before we get to regime change, which may well be, and probably should be, the next iteration of the debate, Friday, the administration will have to decide, in light of what now is no longer a debate, this is one big regime that received non-nuclear sanctions relief that it spent on war making. In light of that's no longer a debate, what are they going to do? And one of the options they're considering, and you should look for this, because if it happens, it will have very specific consequences, is bringing all of these together and saying, you know what? These entities, the Central Bank of Iran, EIKO, other entities that regime entities that received relief under the deal, we're going to sanction them under human rights and corruption, as we should be allowed to do, as the Obama administration suggested, and in fact, as Dennis Ross wrote this morning, should happen. He didn't mention the Central Bank or EIKO, but he did say that entities that received sanctions relief. That's what to look out for, but when it happens, understand why it's happening, because the people who are invested in this deal will say that it's illegitimate, that we're doing an end run around the deal, that we should not be engaged in sanctioning these entities for human rights and corruption and so on. That's a debate that will happen. Now, the administration may not go down that route. They may choose other things to sanction. There are open questions about what they'll choose, but that is one direction they could take. If it happens, you should know where it came from. This is an excellent question, and it gets at a number of things. The question is, fundamentally, are there real moderates inside the Iranian regime? Now, several outlets that routinely talk about Rouhani as a moderate are not doing it in the last few days. For instance, it looks like Reuters is bouncing between calling him a pragmatist and a moderate, which, a number of people have now joked, it makes a certain amount of sense. Certainly, there's a certain element to shooting people in the streets that ends up working for the Iranian regime, and in light of that, he may well be a pragmatist. But nevertheless, this idea of conservatives versus moderates is not one that exists in robust analysis, let's say. So, in his article on the Iran echo chamber, David Samuels, then writing for New York Times Magazine, asked top Obama officials, hey, when you were talking about the Iranian regime as an intelligence matter, so we're talking about the CIA now, did moderates versus conservatives ever come up? And they're like, no, it wasn't a real distinction for us. It's not a real distinction for even some of then President Obama's top negotiators. Wendy Sherman says on stage, there's no such thing as moderates versus hardliners. There's hardliners and hardliners. Rouhani is a hardliner. She wouldn't use this language now, but that he's a revolutionary era cleric. Yeah, there are debates at the margins, but importantly, they're not relevant for American policymaking. The government of Iran is controlled by a regime, and the political parties that participate in their government are part of that regime. And that's not a theoretical issue. That's an issue that we saw coming to the fore this week when all of them banded together to oppose the protesters.
Okay.
Well, to add to what was said, Rouhani is nobody. In Iran, there is one ruler, Khamenei, and period. And he has his military, Revolutionary Guards. And Rouhani was elected by Khamenei, put up there and told the people, you vote for him. And that's the whole situation, the system in Iran. Also, Voice of America is sadly not with. During the last 8 years, Mr. Obama, they were supporting the regime. They would not want anyone of my kind, opposition and women's rights activists, on Voice of America at all. All they want, they bring in sort of semi-clergies or the clergy's sons who are going to Harvard here, and or the people who work for them, or members of NIAC, Treetop Parsi, who is a lobbying organization for the regime, spending millions of dollars in Washington to, and they had the control of the White House during President Obama. So, but Voice of America, there has been so many lawsuits by Iranians who work there against Voice of America management, and many of them have won the lawsuits, and many are in the pipe, because there has been an effort to promote and support the regime, not to help the people of Iran, not to empower the people, not to encourage the people, not to let the people hear people like me or Sarah, or American people who care for them and their rights. So that's one of the issues, and the management is absolutely unacceptable, and so it's been one of the big grievances that Iranian American community opposition has had against Voice of America at all times. Radio Farda, all of them. Islamic regime, especially during the last 8 years of President Obama, they have imported a lot of people into America to take advantage and use the Iranian American community who came here as political refugees, all of us. There's about 2 million of us here. But there are implants by the regime here. The people that they send, their relatives live here. The second night after the uprising in Iran, there was plane fueled ready to take all their children and family out of Iran. They have access, they spend millions of dollars if they are wealthy. I don't know how they are wealthy, but there are a lot of Iranians who've been very successful here, like eBay is an Iranian who started eBay, or a lot of 47 of members of the NASA are Iranians and scientists. But that does not mean that those people who go, us, we don't go to Iran because we know we won't be back.
Okay.
But those are the members of the regime.
Okay.
They're connected to the regime. That's why they keep going back and forth, and they talk to their own families. But one other thing that is, Iranians rose up 9/11 on 9/17, the evening. Iranian people carried candlelight vigil on the cities in Iran. And there is a flower, I don't know what the English name for it, it's a long bouquet of white flowers. They each carried one of those and a candlelight vigil, and they told America, we are on your side. And they got beaten up for it, they got put in prison for it, they got tortured for it, but they did march on the streets. And nobody in America even mentioned, or I have videos of those, I have pictures of those, but nobody talks about all of those good things that Iranian people, when the regime goons were saying dead to America, it's their crowds. The young Iranians on the other side of the streets started yelling, dead to Russia, dead to Russia, dead to Russia. Because Russia has been abused, 200 years abuser of our country, of our people. And so America has a very, I'm sorry, I don't want to be saying this, but I just finished writing a book, and thank God Notre Dame University will be publishing it, hopefully in spring. That book is the history of Iranian women, 8,000 years, but you can see the history of the last 100 years of what the British, what the Russians have done to Iran, how famines of murder of Iranian people, how the Russians have abused and bombed our parliaments, how Iranian people have had the constitutional revolution, women fought for it. But nobody knows anything about us. There is a political part in America called Muslims, and we are one of the 57 different countries, Muslim majorities in that part, while we have nothing to do with like any one of the Arab countries. We are thousands of years old. This is a great, the first proclamation of human rights was written by Cyrus the Great. And by the way, Persia is only one tribe in Iran. I am Iranian, but I'm Mede, Zagros Mountains, and I've been there since Neolithian times, my ancestors. So when they say Persia, Persia was created by the Russians and then by the English people. But we're Iranians. Iran is an Avesta Zoroastrian word name, meaning hospitable people. And we are all Iranians.
I can answer mine very quickly. The Iranians stand to benefit hundreds of billions of dollars more in sanctions relief. That's it. It's not putting the horse in the barn. The Iranians got an immediate cash windfall, but of course they want to ensure that their economy continues to grow and continues to get beyond where U.S. pressure can put it, and they stand to benefit hundreds of billions of dollars more.
The women are the power. They are not on the streets. Well, if the uprising, if you see the uprising during the daylight, you will see women. If you see the protest in front of the university, they're all women on the top of platforms, but the guys are standing down here and clapping for them. If you look at every event, leadership is always women. This is, well, we were gods at one time. Iranian women were gods until the man god came to the game. But Iranian women were gods. The Iranians in those times during Neolithians were worshipping a woman god. So in Iran, women of Iran have never had any problem with Iranian men. Iranian men actually help and support the women. The only problem that Iranian women have had is with the clergies, Shiite clergies. And let me give you one other fact, historical fact. Clergies are not Iranian. Khamenei is not Iranian. His nephew is the leader of the Lebanese Muslim Brotherhood. And they are related because that's where they were imported to Iran from in 1700s by a Turkish occupiers of our country, Turkish tribe who occupied Iran. They were Shiite. Iranians were all kinds of religions. And Muslim ones were Sunni and Sufism, which is the most peaceful sect of Islam. And then these Turkish Safavid Turks occupied Iran because Iran had become weakened. And they were Shiites, and they brought imported Shiite clergies into Iran. And Khomeini adopted one of the sort of programs that one of those clergies, Majlisi was his name, had established in Iran. Iranians have never accepted the Shiite clergies. You can hear all kinds of, sort of bad jokes about them in disrespectful Jews historically. And they don't like Iran or Iranians. Khomeini, when he arrived, the American reporter on the plane asked him, what is your, ask him, how does he feel he's coming back to his homeland after these years? What is your feeling? And he told the reporter, I'm sorry, he told the reporter, Hichi. In Persian means absolute nothing, no feeling. And the translator turned around and says, well, Your Eminence, we have the video, it's there. Your Eminence, you can't say that to an American reporter. He said, that's what I say, you tell him that. But he didn't tell the reporter, Hichi, so Eminence says nothing. He says the Eminence doesn't want to talk about this issue. That's what, and Khomeini told time and again, told the Iranian people right there, we don't care about Iran. Iran for us is a base and a financial support to spread Islam. That's it. So they don't care about us, and Iranians don't want them. That's the fact.
Listen, the protesters face overwhelming odds. If this was 2009, then all they would need to do is get the entire security services and the military to flip and be on their side. Now, they have to do that, and they have to contend with the possibility, the not trivial possibility, that the regime would then call upon Arab militias that it's distributed in the last several years and funded with sanctions relief and so on. We know that this is a regime that is not afraid to circulate Arab militias in order to beat protesters. It happened in 2009. There's a technical question about whether or not those were Arab militiamen that were imported or whether they were there for training and they were just brought out. But nevertheless, they're not even, if it's a use them or lose them situation, yes. And, as Ambassador Bolton said, the population is disarmed, functionally disarmed. How does it happen if it happens? It happens the same way that it happens in any other revolutionary context. You know, these protests have been miscovered to some extent because there's a minor debate over whether or not they're merely economic woes or they're politicized. All successful revolutions, to some extent, are economic. Either they begin that way or they have an element, because to get people marching in the streets, you need people who are hungry and bored. And the quickest way to do that is the quickest route to that is unemployed people. If it happens because the United States acts with determination to impose pain on the regime that highlights for the people that the regime is not an adequate way for them, cannot even provide for their economic livelihood, let alone their political freedom and well-being. And we see a steady erosion. You know, during the revolution you referenced that there was a pivotal moment, but everything that led up to that was these cycles of protests, death, funerals, protests around the funerals, deaths. You saw the beginnings of that in 2009. How does the regime collapse? The regime collapses when it runs out of money or runs out of guns or runs out of legitimacy, usually in some combination. The goal is to have, and this administration, you know, Secretary Tillerson has come very, very close. And remember, Secretary Tillerson is considered by folks on the right to be the dove of the administration. Secretary Tillerson has come very close to outright saying that the regime is the problem. This is an administration that believes, in as many words, that the IRGC is a disproportionately bad actor within Iran and that the regime itself is an IRGC regime. When you put 2 and 2 together, that only adds up to the idea that you have to get rid of the regime. They're not there yet, but if they act with determination, I think they can highlight for the Iranian people that they have support overseas, and they can make a lot of those that pressure real.